The bank's polished walls concealed a silent war, one fought not with guns or words, but with glances that cut deeper than any insult, with procedures designed to erase without a trace. In the midst of this cold battlefield stood a black man, calm yet unyielding, reduced to a shadow by those sworn to serve him. But beneath the surface of dismissal and doubt simmered a secret, one so powerful it would unravel everything the institution thought it controlled. This is not just a story of prejudice. It is a reckoning, a revelation that will force the world to look harder, listen closer, and confront the uncomfortable truth hiding behind quiet discrimination. If you crave stories that grip, shock, and demand justice, like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, because this is a battle you won't forget. The lobby of Whitbridge National Bank shimmered with over-designed luxury, lacquered marble floors, uplighting recessed behind imported wood paneling, and a sweeping chandelier engineered to dazzle rather than illuminate. The kind of place where sound seemed softened, voices hushed by wealth. Obadiah Langley stepped in beneath the high, arched entrance, his pace deliberate and smooth. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, his gray linen suit understated but tailored with subtle elegance, and his leather folio worn soft with time and purpose. He paused briefly at the threshold, letting the cool, filtered air settle around him, brushing away the outside heat. He scanned the room with a discerning eye. The service counters were neatly divided: retail, business, corporate. On one side, a frosted glass door shimmered with the words "Executive Appointments." Obadiah walked toward the main reception island, where a young woman with acrylic nails and a Bluetooth earpiece half hidden under a loosely styled bob sat typing rapidly with one hand while swiping something on her phone with the other. She didn't look up. He stopped in front of the desk, waiting politely. A man in joggers and a sweatshirt came up beside him, holding up a mobile check deposit screen on his phone. The receptionist had snapped up, smile wide, tone suddenly sugar-sweet as she chirped, "Of course, sir. Let me just pull that up for you." Obadiah cleared his throat gently. She turned slightly, a flick of her eyes barely reaching his chin. "You want the kiosk over there," she said, gesturing toward a dusty unit in the far left corner. The screen was clearly blacked out and a strip of yellow tape ran across the base, reading, "Out of order." "I have a scheduled appointment," he said, tone even but firm. She blinked, typed something without looking, and then tapped her earpiece. After a pause, she leaned forward with a plastic smile and said, "Yeah, we're a bit backed up right now. You can head over to our priority support desk. Someone will be with you shortly." She pointed again, this time toward a neglected corner near the emergency exit. A single, dented metal chair sat against the wall beneath a buzzing exit sign. A folding table, stained and off balance, hosted a dusty promotional mug and a stack of outdated brochures. Obadiah glanced toward it, then back at her, but she was already helping someone else. No apology, no confirmation of his name, no explanation for the deviation. Just quiet dismissal under the veil of faux courtesy. He nodded once and walked to the corner without argument. As he passed a plush VIP lounge area, a velvet roped-off haven of suede armchairs, crystal water dispensers, and curated magazines, he noticed a group of college-aged men in pastel golf polos sprawled across the seats. One had his feet on the glass table. No one questioned them. No one asked their business. Obadiah reached the metal chair and eased himself down. The cushion had long lost its padding, and the carpet beneath smelled faintly of mildew and something medicinal. He placed the folio on his lap, centered it, and folded his hands on top. Time passed slowly. 5 minutes, then 10. The VIP guests came and went. A woman in oversized sunglasses, carrying a Louis Vuitton tote, was whisked into a back office after waiting less than 2. Another man in a wrinkled shirt cut the line with a grin, handed his business card to a manager, and was escorted inside. Obadiah stayed seated. He didn't fidget, didn't reach for his phone. He simply watched. Behind the main counter, 2 young tellers leaned in toward each other. One gestured with their chin in his direction. A snort of laughter followed. Another teller pointed a phone in his general area, then turned the screen to her colleague and whispered something behind a hand. Obadiah caught it all in the periphery. Nothing loud, nothing explicit, just quiet erosion. He adjusted the folio's edge a millimeter, as though that small act might reassert his presence in a space determined to pretend he didn't exist. A security guard passed by, young, broad-shouldered, standing a bit too upright to appear relaxed. He glanced at Obadiah, slowed down, then hovered by a column 6 feet away. Not looking at him, not quite. Just staying close, like a shadow that hadn't yet earned permission to be real. Obadiah glanced toward the main clock. 19 minutes past his appointment time. He shifted in the seat slightly and caught the eye of a junior associate passing by with a clipboard. She froze for a second when he looked at her, then walked faster, pretending she hadn't seen him. A man in jeans and a baseball cap entered the lobby and walked directly up to the executive check-in without resistance. A receptionist smiled brightly and called him by name. Obadiah's eyes followed them until they disappeared behind the frosted glass. It was starting to ache now, the indignity of pretending not to notice. Pretending this was normal. He had made no error. He had arrived on time. He had submitted every document in advance. He had followed every required channel. Yet somehow he'd been cast as the problem without a single spoken word. A sudden voice cut across the room. "Langley? Mr. Langley?" Obadiah stood smoothly, his folio tucked neatly under his arm. A thin man with a pale complexion and a nervous smile waved him over toward a hallway flanked by offices. His badge read T. Granger, Client Services. Without apology or greeting, Granger turned and led the way. The hallway was lined with sleek, mirrored glass, reflecting not just Obadiah's calm exterior, but the sharp glances cast his way by 2 passing employees. They looked him up and down, then leaned toward each other as they kept walking. Granger stopped at a small office with a door barely propped open and motioned for Obadiah to enter. The room was sterile, clinical. Fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead. A single desk sat cluttered with manila folders, most of them marked with bright red tags that read flagged, review, or internal. Granger motioned for Obadiah to take a seat while he sifted through a stack, muttering to himself. "Ah, here we are." He retrieved Obadiah's folder, opened it, and frowned. There seemed to be some inconsistencies with the documentation, he said without looking up. Obadiah tilted his head slightly. "Inconsistencies?" he asked, tone even. Granger still didn't meet his eyes. Instead, he stood, carried the folder out into the hallway, and disappeared into another office without a word. Obadiah sat alone, the white walls around him humming with artificial quiet. Through the glass, he could see Granger showing the folder to a woman in a black blazer who responded with a shrug and pointed to a third man behind another desk. The folder passed hands again. The third man, a middle-aged staffer with a pinched face, opened the folder, frowned, and reached for a stamp. Through the glass, Obadiah watched him slam down a red sticker marked "Pending Verification" on the front page, then slap the folder shut without another glance. It was then tossed onto a separate stack of papers, collecting dust beside an unplugged printer. Granger returned a moment later, empty-handed. He sat down with a carefully rehearsed smile and handed Obadiah a printed form. The text was plain and emotionless. The bank reserves the right to refuse service if the client cannot demonstrate clear and valid financial intent to the satisfaction of its internal criteria. There was no signature line, no explanation of what had triggered this assessment. "This is just part of our compliance check," Granger said, folding his hands as if to signal finality. Nothing personal, just protocol. Obadiah didn't move. He studied the document, then looked up, his expression unchanged. "What about the materials I provided?" he asked. "We reviewed them," Granger replied. "But because of the amount involved and certain risk flags, we're obligated to escalate." "Risk flags?" Obadiah echoed. "Based on what criteria?" Granger shifted, suddenly preoccupied with aligning the pens on his desk. "Unfortunately, that's confidential. But you're welcome to submit a formal response if you feel the assessment is inaccurate." He reached into a drawer and handed over a complaint form printed on low-quality paper. Obadiah took it without expression, but the weight in his chest pressed heavier. This wasn't about process. It never had been. His documentation had been complete, notarized, and delivered in advance. His appointment had been scheduled through a private banking liaison. Yet he was now being asked to justify his presence like a trespasser. The room was cold, the walls sterile, and still, no one had asked him a single relevant financial question. No one had discussed the investment plan he'd requested. No one had asked his goals or risk tolerance. Instead, his file had become a hot object, passed hand to hand like a ticking clock, each movement laced with unspoken skepticism. He stood, slowly, controlled. The same man who had accepted silent mistreatment in the lobby now felt that erasure expand through every square inch of this building. The manila folder marked pending hadn't disappeared. It had become a symbol, a deliberate tool. They hadn't asked what Obadiah intended to do with the deposit because they had already decided he didn't belong in the conversation. He left the office with the complaint form in hand. The priority support corner remained exactly as he had left it, empty, still beneath the flickering emergency sign, with the same warped folding table and the same faint odor of mold and damp carpet. He approached the metal chair again, but didn't sit this time. Instead, he stood beside it, arms at his sides, breathing slow and measured. After a few seconds, a security guard emerged from a corridor near the vault access. He was young, broad-chested, with the over-alert posture of someone who took his role far more seriously than anyone asked him to. He stopped about 10 feet away from Obadiah and planted his boots deliberately, one hand resting lightly on the holster of his radio. Obadiah met his gaze briefly, nodded once, then looked away. The guard didn't respond. He stayed where he was, silent, eyes trained just over Obadiah's shoulder. A minute passed, then 5. The guard tapped the side of his earpiece and muttered into his radio, soft, clipped phrases that didn't carry across the room clearly, but just loud enough for Obadiah to make out fragments. Subject remained stationary near exit B, the guard said at one point, voice neutral but edged. A few moments later, still no movement appears to be lingering, no staff contact yet confirmed. Obadiah didn't move, didn't react, but he heard every word. The guard's language was designed to be procedural, non-confrontational, but the effect was the same, a broadcast of suspicion. He wasn't just a customer now. He was a subject, an unknown, something undefined and potentially dangerous. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The guard stayed rooted in place, occasionally adjusting his stance or checking his belt as if preparing for something more physical than observation. Clients began to notice. A woman in a suit glanced twice at Obadiah and then veered toward another teller. A man with a stroller walked the long way around the lobby to avoid walking between them. The presence of security didn't protect him. It isolated him, made him a point of caution. The receptionist glanced toward him once, her expression unreadable, then went back to scrolling through a list of scheduled appointments that clearly no longer included him. Finally, a different bank employee approached, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and an overconfident stride. His name badge identified him as V. Torres, verification lead. Without offering a seat, Torres gestured toward the ID kiosk nearby and said he would need to scan Obadiah's identification again for biometric verification. Obadiah, still calm, produced his ID from his folio and followed Torres to the sleek black terminal mounted beside the teller counters. The screen flashed to life as he approached. A voice from the kiosk speaker welcomed him and prompted for thumbprint and facial scan. Obadiah followed the instructions, placing his thumb carefully and standing upright to meet the camera lens. There was a pause, longer than normal. The screen flickered. Then came a low, pulsing tone, and the text appeared in red. Identity flagged. Internal watch list. Verification escalation required. The sound wasn't loud, but it wasn't discreet either. The guard, who had followed at a distance, took a half step forward. Torres frowned slightly, then looked at Obadiah with an expression that seemed to say, "You see? This is why." Without a word, he tapped on his tablet and turned away, leaving Obadiah facing the screen that still displayed the alert in flashing red. For several seconds, no one approached. No one shut off the screen. The message stayed, burning itself into the vision of everyone nearby. A pair of young interns behind the counter nudged each other and stole glances. One of them whispered something behind a cupped hand. The other laughed, but quickly stifled it. Obadiah turned away from the terminal, replacing his ID into the folio with precise movements. He said nothing. His face betrayed nothing, but the silence around him was loud, a bubble of tension that moved wherever he moved. Torres returned eventually with a new paper form that looked identical to the last one, except this one had an added box at the bottom labeled Risk Classification Dispute Optional. A sharply dressed man emerged from the far side of the lobby, holding a black leather tablet case and wearing a strained expression of performance professionalism. His badge identified him as D. Carrington Senior Financial Officer. Carrington offered a clipped nod that stopped short of politeness, then gestured for Obadiah to follow. No apology, no explanation for the delay, just an unspoken expectation of compliance. Obadiah complied not out of submission, but because resistance would serve no purpose. Not yet. Carrington led him down a narrow hall lined with sleek, frosted glass offices. Inside each were muted glimpses of business being conducted. Laptops open, suits hunched over spreadsheets, muffled voices on speakerphone. The door at the end of the corridor opened into a room slightly larger than the others, its lighting colder, the furniture minimalist to the point of punishment. Carrington entered first, motioned for Obadiah to sit across from him at a matte black table, then pulled the blinds shut one by one, plunging the room into a sterile kind of privacy. The door clicked softly behind them, and for a moment, silence filled the space. Carrington opened his case and retrieved a packet of documents clipped with a heavy black binder. Without preamble, he slid it across the table toward Obadiah. "Before we proceed," Carrington said, his tone flat, "I'll need you to sign this liability waiver." Obadiah looked down at the title on the first page. Limited Service and Disclosure Agreement High-Risk Clients. There was no cover letter, no context, no explanation of how or why he had been reclassified under this vague and damning term. The document was dense with legal jargon, paragraphs outlining the bank's right to suspend, withhold, or reject services without obligation, indemnification clauses in case of financial loss, and a sweeping section absolving the institution of all responsibility for potential harm due to procedural delays or denied access. Nowhere did it state what qualified a client as high risk, nor did it acknowledge the existence of any formal review process. It was a trap disguised as policy. Obadiah's eyes moved slowly across the page. His pulse remained steady, but a burn had begun to gather low in his chest, the kind that came not from shock, but from the exhausting repetition of being stripped of legitimacy. Carrington tapped his pen against the edge of the table, a soft but deliberate sound. "This is standard for cases that require additional scrutiny," he said, looking past Obadiah as he spoke, as if reading from a script printed on the far wall. "It's not a judgment, just procedure. If you choose not to sign, I can't authorize any further action on your account." His tone implied neutrality, but his body language betrayed satisfaction. There was an air of quiet coercion, pressure without threat, consequence without accusation. Obadiah did not respond immediately. He closed the folder slowly, returned it to the center of the table, and folded his hands. "May I ask what prompted this reassessment?" he said, keeping his voice composed. Carrington didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back and opened his laptop, tapping a few keys. "I'm afraid I don't have access to those notes," he said. The flag came from compliance. Obadiah knew better. Compliance was not a shadow entity. It was a shield. The phrase compliance issue was a convenient barrier, used often to obscure bias behind layers of bureaucracy. A system designed to feel impenetrable when challenged, even as it moved with surgical precision to humiliate. Before Obadiah could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A younger staff member entered carrying a tray of beverages, glass cups of sparkling water with citrus slices floating delicately, intended for client comfort. She moved with speed, clearly coached to be discreet. She placed a cup beside Carrington's laptop, then another beside the legal packet still resting in front of Obadiah. But her motion with his was abrupt, careless. The cup landed with a dull thud, and a thin stream of condensation-soaked water immediately slid onto the edge of the document, bleeding ink across the header. The woman said nothing. She didn't apologize. She didn't offer a napkin. She simply turned and exited the room without making eye contact, closing the door behind her with the finality of a judge's gavel. Carrington said nothing. He didn't even glance at the spill. He simply resumed typing, as if the minor act of disrespect was too insignificant to register. But Obadiah felt it. In that moment, the drip of water across a page of rights he never had was more offensive than all the silence that had come before. It was the indifference, the casual nature of it. Only the distant echo of voices from the hallway and the muffled hum of machinery beyond the blinds. It became clear this was not an oversight. He had been left to sit, intentionally, like an unanswered question. Finally, without being prompted, Obadiah stood, took the waiver, and placed it carefully back into his folio without signing. He opened the door, walked into the hallway with measured control, and headed back toward the lobby, retracing the same steps under the same indifferent gazes. This time, no one attempted to stop him. They watched him pass like he was part of the architecture, unseen unless disruptive. When he returned to the main floor, the receptionist stiffened slightly, but said nothing. He moved back to the priority support desk, which remained as neglected and uncomfortable as before. The same metal chair still sat beneath the failing emergency light, and the table still held the same wrinkled brochures that had not been replaced in years. He took his seat again, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because to stand would be a declaration, and declarations were punished here. Not through confrontation, but through a subtler, more calculated form of erasure. Across the room, a team of staff huddled behind one of the central teller counters, speaking in low tones while one of them typed frantically at a terminal. Their eyes flicked toward Obadiah intermittently, as if checking to see whether he remained where they expected him to remain, still, quiet, contained. At one point, a woman in a navy skirt suit approached a glass door marked operations and entered swiftly. Moments later, the energy in the room shifted. Monitors on the wall began updating. A digital transaction panel displayed new alerts in red text. The receptionist whispered something into her headset, paused, then nodded to no one in particular. Then came the first chime. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle tone from the terminal behind the counter, but the message was impossible to miss. A pop-up filled the upper right corner of the screen behind the desk. Suspected account notifies security immediately. The staff member reading it did not panic. She leaned slightly to her left, picked up her phone, and pressed a single key. The call didn't last long. She nodded again and resumed typing. Within moments, a second alert appeared on the same screen. Client account rerouted fraud monitoring division. Manual hold active. Obadiah didn't need to see the exact screen to know something had changed. The staff's demeanor shifted. A tightness entered their movements. Their professional detachment thickened, almost as if guilt had to be hidden beneath procedure. Then the intercom activated. The speakers embedded into the ceiling came to life with a clean digital beep. A male voice followed, unhurried, formal, but with just enough gravity to pierce the air. Attention staff, unusual baggage or activity detected at Section 2. Please follow standard precautionary protocol. Security standby requested. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Every head in the lobby turned toward Section 2. Section 2 was where Obadiah was sitting. People turned slowly at first, then more openly, their eyes scanning the area, their gazes locking on the solitary figure beneath the emergency light. A woman with a stroller stepped back toward the door. A man holding a briefcase looked down, then shuffled sideways. The receptionist didn't make eye contact. A guard appeared near the elevator bay, talking into his radio as he approached the desk. Obadiah remained seated. His face stayed still, his hands folded over the folio on his lap. He had not moved. He had not raised his voice. He had not left his seat, but now the room was treating him like a threat. The word baggage hung in the air, full of implication. It didn't say explosive. It didn't say weapon. But it didn't have to. It was a code for suspicion without cause. A convenient euphemism to trigger action without accountability. The people around him began stepping away, creating distance. A teller whispered to a colleague, glancing in his direction. The security guard moved forward slowly, not aggressively, but with the posture of someone trained to act if needed. Another staffer behind the counter began closing the till drawers, one by one, swift and methodical. A red security light blinked silently near the vault interface. Obadiah didn't move. He simply looked forward, as if staring beyond the wall in front of him, into a world far from this one. He had known humiliation before, but there was something uniquely surgical about this. This wasn't the crude cruelty of a shouted slur or an open insult. This was institutional degradation, quiet, clean, systemic. A dismantling of dignity without fingerprints. He watched as the guard made his way closer. Their eyes met for the briefest second. The guard didn't speak. He stopped a few feet away and pressed his earpiece, giving a silent signal. Obadiah felt every breath in the room shift toward discomfort. Across the room, the receptionist spoke quietly into her headset. A printer chirped to life somewhere behind the glass walls of the administrative offices. The lower was barely audible, but it sent a new signal. A paper trail was being crafted. Within minutes, an assistant manager with a stiff walk and a tablet in hand approached him. Her badge read, "A Driscoll Client Response." Her smile was manufactured and strained at the corners. "Mr. Langley," she said with brutal brightness, "thank you for your continued patience. We've processed your intake form and restructured it for documentation purposes. I just need a quick signature for verification before we proceed." She handed him a printed document. Obadiah glanced down at the page and immediately felt a new layer of insult crawl beneath the skin. It was his original handwritten form, the one he had filled out neatly and carefully upon his arrival, structured, articulate, and precise. But the version now in front of him was a clumsy, fragmented reconstruction. Phrases had been rewritten in poor grammar. Sentences were chopped up. His description of the intended transaction, originally framed in professional, clear terms, had been distorted into incoherence, as if written by someone unfamiliar with basic English structure. Where he had written investment holding to be placed under discretionary advisory services, the new version read, "Want to put big money in account for help maybe stock go higher." Other lines had been similarly butchered. There were missing verbs, awkward misspellings, words omitted entirely. It read not like a professional submission, but like a parody, a caricature. Obadiah looked up slowly. "This isn't my form," he said calmly. Driscoll blinked, confused. "Well, it's your information. We just digitized it and clarified the phrasing to match internal templates." Her tone was flat, her expression unreadable. Obadiah studied her, noting how carefully she had rehearsed that line. This was not a mistake. This was procedure. An engineered mistranslation meant to degrade the credibility of the source by rewriting him into someone unrecognizable. "You changed my words," he said, each syllable measured. "No, we restructured them for clarity," she corrected with mechanical insistence. Sometimes handwriting can be difficult to process, and formatting helps reduce audit errors. He could feel it now, the tight choreography, the translation of a man's voice into a caricature, performed with plausible deniability. He didn't sign. Instead, he returned the paper. "I'll wait to review a scanned copy of my original submission," he said. Driscoll hesitated, then forced another tight smile and retreated. No apology, no promise to check, just quiet withdrawal. Within moments, the real humiliation began. The main screen in the lobby, usually reserved for showcasing bank promotions, financial news tickers, and curated community events, flashed briefly and then shifted to a live feed. From the ceiling above the entrance, a camera angle appeared, tilted slightly to show the waiting area in which Obadiah sat. The footage zoomed slowly inward. At first, it was subtle, just a wide shot of the general space. But over the next 20 seconds, the feed narrowed in on Obadiah. The lens tightened its focus, centering on him in crisp high definition, capturing the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the wear on the edge of his folio. He was now the only thing on the screen. A staff member behind the desk glanced up and smirked. Another nudged her colleague, who leaned over to see. A whisper passed, then a chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Obadiah didn't look at the screen. He didn't need to. The energy in the room told him everything. He had become spectacle, not just suspect, now entertainment. A curiosity to be gawked at, a subject to be whispered about, dissected, dismissed. Behind him, someone took a picture on their phone, quickly turning the device so it looked casual, harmless. A young intern at the front desk leaned toward her monitor and began typing. Seconds later, another alert sounded softly. This time not an emergency, but a system notification. A pop-up message read, "Client 45,832-9. Note update pending verification." The note was visible for only a flash, but it was long enough to be noticed by the man standing 2 stations over. He turned toward Obadiah and raised an eyebrow, then turned back and resumed his task, shaking his head slightly as if confirming a suspicion. Obadiah sat still, but inside he could feel the architecture of power at work. The way the institution had begun scripting him into something lesser, transforming his presence into something laughable. One by one, people began to shift in the room. The devaluation was complete. And then, as if on cue, the final tier of institutional authority emerged. The lobby doors opened with a crisp pneumatic hiss, and a figure stepped through, older, commanding, dressed in a dark 3-piece suit that stood out from the business casual of the surrounding staff. His walk was measured, his expression neutral, but his presence brought with it the silence that always followed proximity to power. Behind him came 2 security officers, not the earlier Rent-A-Cop variety, but senior response personnel, professional, expressionless, wearing slim-cut tactical jackets that concealed radios and reinforced batons. The manager glanced once toward the front desk, received a nod from the receptionist, and continued his path toward Obadiah with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been denied space. He stopped 3 feet away. The guards flanked him. "Mr. Langley," the manager said, without introducing himself, "I'm going to ask that you step outside with us while we clarify a few internal discrepancies. This isn't a refusal of service, just a temporary relocation. I'm sure you understand." The tone was calm. The phrasing was polished. But the implication was unmistakable. Move. Leave. Exit quietly so we can preserve our performance of civility. Obadiah didn't speak. He looked at the manager for a moment, then down at the folio in his hands. The warped leather cover, the still visible watermark from the spilled drink, the folded forms he had not signed. It was all still there, the full record of every indignity lined up like a paper trail of engineered humiliation. He nodded once. The guards did not touch him. They didn't need to. They walked half a step behind him, close enough to mark ownership, distant enough to maintain plausible deniability. The receptionist avoided his eyes. The intern at the desk looked down. The same staff who had whispered and laughed now pretended to be absorbed in keyboards and spreadsheets. No one wanted to be caught staring at a man escorted out. Obadiah's steps were slow and deliberate as he made his way across the lobby. His shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, echoing in the unnatural quiet that had settled over the space. He passed the security kiosk, past the chairs, past the teller counters, and then he stopped. Just a few feet from the exit stood a digital donor wall, an interactive display that looped through slides of contributors, stakeholders, and commemorative donors who had, in some way, helped build the institution. It was a public monument to private wealth. Normally, no one paid it any attention. It was part of the background, like the marble columns or the curated art on the walls. But now, with everyone watching, Obadiah turned toward it and raised a single hand. He tapped the screen once. Then again. The display beeped, recognized his presence, and began to scroll. A list appeared. Top institutional patrons, strategic acquisition partners. Logos of equity groups, hedge funds, and parent corporations filled the screen. Obadiah tapped again. A submenu opened. Recent acquisitions, fiscal year summary. He selected one, Brookfield South Capital Holdings. The screen reloaded. A tiered list appeared. Executive Committee, lead investment stakeholders, division chairs. The screen zoomed automatically to the top 3 names. And there it was, in clean, white lettering beneath a company insignia, displayed for everyone to read. Obadiah D. Langley Principal Partner, U.S. Private Equity Division. The room held its breath. The guards stopped moving. The manager shifted just slightly, his composure cracking for the first time. The staff who had just moments ago laughed at his distorted form, pointed at his surveillance feed, and dismissed his presence as background noise, now stared in stunned silence. The receptionist froze mid-keystroke. The intern's jaw parted, but no sound came. No one spoke, not even the manager. Obadiah didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't correct anyone. He simply turned, facing the center of the room, and stood as still as he had all morning. Except now, the posture meant something different. He was no longer framed by security alerts and whispered notes. He was framed by fact, by data, by a title their own institution had broadcast unknowingly at the exact moment they attempted to escort him out. He didn't need to say a word. The room did it for him. The horror that passed through the receptionist's eyes wasn't theatrical. It was real. Recognition twisted with shame. Staff exchanged frozen looks, the weight of realization falling like a hammer in the sterile, curated quiet. They had profiled, redirected, stalled, dismissed, flagged, laughed, and almost expelled the man whose signature underwrote the very foundation they operated from, whose name lived not in ink or rumor, but in the permanent digital record of ownership. The manager cleared his throat, as if summoning the ability to speak. But nothing came. There was no protocol for this, no escalation tree for what to do when the target of your discrimination turns out to be your benefactor. Obadiah turned back to the screen. The display still glowed, a silent indictment framed in polite Helvetica. He stepped forward, reached out, and calmly pressed the screen again, returning it to the homepage. He passed the same receptionist who had failed to look at him earlier, and though she now stood, posture stiff and ready to assist, he gave her no signal, no nod. She wasn't being ignored. She was being measured. Every person who had participated in his degradation was now under a silent but undeniable recalibration. The guards didn't follow. They remained planted, as if suddenly aware that proximity to him no longer denoted control but exposure. The manager, still recovering from the blow of revelation, trailed behind. His practiced composure splintered by fear not of Obadiah's power, but of what that power implied: accountability. Obadiah reached the central desk. The same desk that earlier had ignored his documents, rerouted his requests, and used compliance as camouflage for discrimination. He set his folio on the counter, opened it slowly, and withdrew the now warped waiver, the distorted intake form, and the complaint sheet they had handed him with casual contempt. He laid them out like evidence, because they were. The receptionist moved as if to call someone, perhaps from operations, perhaps the same verification lead who had once treated him like a burden. But Obadiah spoke before she could move. No more calls. Bring the branch audit officer. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of someone who had transcended the false etiquette of institutional theater. The manager stepped forward, finding his voice again, strained and trembling beneath the surface of a corporate smile. "Mr. Langley, please allow us to fast-track your request. We're deeply sorry for the misunderstanding. I can personally ensure." Obadiah turned, just slightly, and looked at him. A pause stretched between them. It wasn't just the look of a man unimpressed. It was the look of someone weighing consequences. "You can't fast-track respect," Obadiah said, voice smooth but edged like honed steel. "You don't expedite justice. You audit the system that failed to recognize it." The words didn't shout, but they struck louder than anything else that morning. The receptionist froze, her headset dangling in midair. The few clients still lingering in the lobby stiffened, sensing the shift, the tilt of power back to where it belonged. A staff member behind the counter bolted into the back office. Another whispered to someone on the phone. The manager's facade fractured further. He nodded quickly, almost reflexively. Of course. Absolutely. I'll initiate the audit immediately. He fumbled with his tablet, his fingers trembling as he tapped the internal escalation protocols reserved only for critical reputational threats. Obadiah stood still, watching the machinery turn, not because it wanted to, but because it had been exposed. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. Institutions like this one were built to withstand complaint, absorb shame, and outlast silence. But they could not survive exposure, not when power stared them in the face and asked for a record. Within minutes, the branch audit officer arrived. She was older, with silver-threaded hair and a practiced neutrality that had been finely sharpened over years of internal investigations. Her presence was followed by a young associate carrying a digital recorder and a tablet synced to the bank's compliance logs. They approached Obadiah, and for the first time that day, someone in uniform addressed him with full, deliberate acknowledgement. "Mr. Langley," the audit officer said, her voice devoid of condescension, "we're aware of the inconsistencies in your service this morning. We'll begin immediate documentation of your account experience. Would you prefer a private conference room?" Obadiah shook his head. "No, this happened here. It gets addressed here." She nodded without hesitation and motioned for the associate to begin recording. The young man activated the device. "Timestamp," he said softly. "Branch audit. Client testimony initiation." Obadiah stepped closer to the desk, gesturing to the documents still laid out. "I want a line-by-line breakdown," he said, "of every action taken on my account today. Every individual involved. Every note in the system. I want a record of who authorized rerouting me to the support corner, who flagged me in the risk system, who entered the grammar edits on the intake form. And I want surveillance reviewed for staff misconduct, particularly the lobby display feed." The audit officer's pen moved quickly. Her associate typed rapidly, syncing his entries with the bank's internal CRM and compliance logs. Obadiah didn't look at the staff anymore. He looked only at the facts. The people around him had become irrelevant. Their reactions, their stammered regrets, their sideways glances, none of it mattered now. The record would matter. The evidence would matter. And their fear of that evidence would force change in ways apology never could. The manager tried once more to regain control, stepping forward again. "Please, Mr. Langley, rest assured we're taking this seriously. I've already notified our regional director. We'll handle this at the highest level." Obadiah turned slowly, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough to burn. "I am the highest level," he said. "You just didn't look high enough." The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence had returned, heavier this time, laced not with confusion or fear, but with consequence. Obadiah took a breath, slow and even. The audit officer continued writing. The associate nodded after each entry. The guards still hadn't moved. They stood like ghosts now, present, but void of authority. A command ran silently through the servers, sweeping across every email inbox, every instant message thread, every recorded phone call associated with the past 72 hours. Words that had been whispered in private chat rooms between staff members, phrases spoken behind closed doors, casual remarks made in hallways. All were culled and flagged by artificial intelligence trained to detect bias, misconduct, and unprofessional conduct. The flagged content was automatically compiled into a comprehensive dossier. It included chat transcripts where staff speculated about difficult clients, internal emails with veiled references to potentially problematic individuals, and audio recordings from security team radios capturing coded phrases that hinted at profiling and racial suspicion. This dossier was immediately encrypted and forwarded, with the highest priority, to the Regional Compliance Director and the bank's Central Ethics Committee. As the report arrived, a flurry of activity exploded at the branch. a flurry not visible to the customers, still milling quietly but fully felt by the employees. The manager who had tried to sideline Obadiah was summoned to an emergency meeting. The receptionist who had ignored him was directed to vacate her station and await reassignment. The security guards who had hovered with suspicion were ordered off the premises without ceremony. Within a half hour, name tags were collected, lockers emptied, and access cards deactivated. The branch effectively ceased to function in its previous form. Signage was hastily changed. Notices appeared in employee break rooms announcing mandatory retraining sessions focused on unconscious bias, customer service equity, and compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Observant customers noticed the sudden shift. Some who had witnessed the earlier events exchanged quiet whispers. A few asked the remaining staff what was going on, only to be met with corporate-neutral responses about system upgrades and service improvements. But behind the scenes, the repercussions rippled far beyond. The bank's central office prepared official statements, scheduled meetings with community leaders, and reviewed policies that had been quietly enabling systemic bias under the guise of risk management. Public relations teams began drafting press releases to frame the incident as a catalyst for positive change rather than an isolated failure. Yet none of this mitigated the human cost, the toll on Obadiah, or the countless others who had suffered silently over the years. In the middle of this upheaval, Obadiah remained detached from the chaos. He knew he had done more than expose one branch's failures. He had cracked the veneer that protected institutions from scrutiny, revealing the discomfort of those who thought themselves untouchable. His phone buzzed quietly, a notification from his legal team confirming receipt of the audit dossier and the initiation of formal proceedings. It was a sign that the battle had entered a new phase. Meanwhile, the new staff brought in to replace the dismissed team arrived with orientation folders, code of conduct manuals, and the weight of the public spotlight. Trainers emphasized vigilance, respect, and inclusion, concepts previously abstract to the branch, but now mandatory in practice. Obadiah's name was not whispered in the halls. It was printed in official documents, cited in training materials, and presented as a case study in how not to treat a client. The impact was immediate and visible. The branch's previous culture of casual discrimination was no longer sustainable. Managers who had once ignored complaints found themselves under scrutiny. Frontline staff who had laughed behind his back were now required to complete sensitivity training and submit written reflections on their behavior. Customers who had witnessed the incident returned, tentatively at first, testing the changes in service and tone. Over the next several weeks, feedback was collected through anonymous surveys, with a notable increase in positive reviews tied directly to improved inclusivity and respect. Obadiah watched this transformation from a distance, aware that the journey was far from over. Structural bias was a deeply rooted problem, one that demanded persistent attention and accountability. Yet the immediate consequences had sent a clear message. Silent tolerance of discrimination would no longer be ignored. The bank's leadership had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own institution, truths exposed by a man they had tried to dismiss, degrade, and remove. Obadiah knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the scales tip slightly in favor of justice. The system, for all its faults, had responded when faced with undeniable evidence and unwavering demand. And that response, however imperfect, was a victory, not just for him, but for everyone who had been denied dignity before. Obadiah stepped through the glass doors of Whitbridge National Bank one last time, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished marble floor. The lobby was quieter now than it had been throughout the morning, the atmosphere subtly altered by the events that had unfolded. No longer was he met with dismissive glances or whispered conversations. Instead, the silence that enveloped the space carried the weight of change, a heavy, solemn acknowledgement that things could no longer remain the same. His tall frame moved steadily toward the exit, carrying the worn leather folio under his arm like a badge of endurance rather than submission. The staff watched as he passed, their expressions unreadable, but undeniably marked by the gravity of the moment. Obadiah did not glance back. He had no need to. The message he had conveyed through his presence, his unwavering calm, and his insistence on accountability had spoken louder than any words. Once outside, the city's mid-morning bustle enveloped him. The sounds of car horns, distant chatter, and footsteps on pavement forming a backdrop to a personal sense of closure. Across the street, the bank's exterior had already begun to shift in real time. The massive LED billboard, which had for years displayed changing financial news, brand campaigns, and congratulatory messages to corporate clients, now glowed with a fresh new image. The logo of Whitbridge National Bank remained central, but beneath it appeared a new slogan, bold and simple: respect, regardless. It was a phrase that carried an unmistakable weight, an unambiguous commitment to dignity, equity, and the recognition of every individual who stepped through their doors. The slogan wasn't just marketing. It was a promise forged from the fire of the morning's reckoning. Behind the scenes, the bank's leadership had initiated a profound internal overhaul. The previous months of retraining, audits, and policy revisions were beginning to bear fruit. Staff who had once ignored or perpetuated systemic bias were now engaged in continuous education about inclusivity, empathy, and the critical importance of fairness. The bank had become a case study in corporate accountability, often cited in industry forums and community meetings as a model for confronting internal discrimination head-on. The year-end report, released weeks later and distributed to shareholders and community partners alike, bore a remarkable admission. Written not in corporate doublespeak, but with clear, direct language, the report acknowledged the failures that had occurred at the branch level. It detailed the steps taken to remedy the culture, including the establishment of an independent oversight committee and the implementation of a staff training protocol personally designed by Obadiah Langley himself, who, the report stated, was not only a founding chairman of the bank's parent company, but also a living testament to the need for ongoing vigilance against bias. The language was unflinching, candid about the institution's flaws, while signaling an unwavering dedication to improvement. Obadiah's name appeared prominently, no longer as a subject of suspicion or a target of discrimination, but as a symbol of progress. In his community, the story spread quietly at first, told in hushed conversations and private dinners among business leaders, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens who had long grappled with the silent barriers embedded in institutions like Whitbridge. He was praised not for confrontation, but for resilience, not for anger, but for insistence on justice tempered with dignity. And while the journey was far from complete, the systemic roots of bias were deep and persistent. The shift marked a crucial milestone. For Obadiah, the victory was bittersweet. The scars of the morning's degradation remained etched in memory, reminders of how fragile respect could be when left unchecked. But he carried a deeper understanding now, that justice was not a single moment of reckoning, but a continuous process of accountability, education, and humility. Standing on the steps of the bank one evening months later, he watched as employees and clients alike moved through the doors with a new sense of purpose. He saw smiles where there had once been suspicion, heard greetings where silence had fallen, felt in the very air a subtle but unmistakable change. The world was imperfect, he knew. Institutions faltered, people failed, but the promise of respect, without conditions, without exception, was a beacon worth fighting for. As the sun set behind the skyline, Obadiah walked away from the bank, his shadow long on the pavement. Behind him, the LED screen flickered, the slogan glowing steadily in the twilight: respect, regardless. It was a message to every person who entered those doors and beyond, that dignity was not earned by status or wealth, but was an inherent right. That justice demanded vigilance, not complacency. And that sometimes the most profound change came not from confrontation, but from the quiet courage to be seen and to insist on being treated as such. The end of Obadiah's day at Whitbridge National Bank was not just the closing of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new narrative, one where accountability was not optional, where respect was the baseline, and where the legacy of bias was challenged at every turn. a narrative that would be written not just by leaders or institutions, but by every person willing to stand firm in the face of injustice. And so, with his head held high and his spirit unbroken, Obadiah walked on, knowing that the fight for justice was never truly over, but that every step forward mattered. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more gripping narratives that explore justice and resilience. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Obadiah's journey? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and join the conversation.